Transparency is the foundation of accountability. In this segment, you will see unfiltered and unedited reality. We are presenting raw, primary footage directly from the front lines of justice, offering you an objective window into the complexities of the law.
We can do this the easy way or the hard way.
I am recording. You are harassing me on my property.
Ma'am, I'm going to need you to...
Do not touch my property.
This is a nice neighborhood. People like you need to understand you're being watched.
I am Federal Judge Veronica.
The Christmas lights twinkled peacefully across the quiet suburban neighborhood as snow began to fall that December evening. Most families were inside, wrapping last-minute presents or settling down to watch holiday movies together. But for one prominent federal judge, this Christmas night would become the most humiliating and career-defining moment of her life. What started as a simple evening at home would spiral into a confrontation that would destroy multiple careers, result in federal charges, and expose a pattern of corruption that had been festering for over a decade. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button because this story has twists that you absolutely will not see coming. Judge Veronica Hayes had spent her entire adult life building an impeccable reputation. At 52 years old, she was one of the youngest federal judges ever appointed in her district. She had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School, worked as a prosecutor for 8 years, and served as a state judge for another 6 before receiving her federal appointment. Her colleagues respected her fairness, her legal scholarship was cited nationwide, and she had never once been the subject of a formal complaint or investigation. Judge Hayes lived alone in a modest 2-story home in Riverside Heights, an upscale but not ostentatious neighborhood about 20 minutes from the federal courthouse. She had purchased the house 3 years earlier after her divorce was finalized. It was her sanctuary, the place where she could shed the weight of her judicial robes and simply be Veronica, not Your Honor. That Christmas evening, she was doing exactly what millions of other Americans were doing. She had spent the afternoon video calling her parents and siblings who lived across the country. She had cooked herself a small Christmas dinner, opened a bottle of wine, and settled in to read a novel by the fireplace. She was wearing comfortable clothes, her hair was down, and for the first time in weeks, she felt truly relaxed. At approximately 8:30 that evening, Judge Hayes heard her doorbell ring. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her neighbors knew she valued her privacy, especially during the holidays when she rarely entertained. She looked through the peephole and saw 2 police officers standing on her front porch. Both were white men. One appeared to be in his 40s and the other looked younger, maybe early 30s. Judge Hayes opened the door, leaving the chain lock engaged, and asked how she could help them. The older officer, whose name tag read Detective Raymond Burke, said they were responding to a noise complaint from one of her neighbors. Judge Hayes was confused. She had been alone all evening, reading quietly by the fireplace. The television wasn't even on. She told the officers there must be some mistake. Detective Burke asked if anyone else was in the house. Judge Hayes said no. She was alone. He asked if she had been playing music or having a party. Again, she said no. She explained that she had been having a quiet Christmas evening by herself and couldn't imagine what neighbor would have complained or what they would have complained about. The younger officer, Officer Jake Morrison, stepped forward and asked if they could come inside to take a look around. Judge Hayes asked why that would be necessary. Burke said they needed to verify that there was no disturbance and that everyone in the house was safe. Judge Hayes again stated that she was alone and there had been no disturbance of any kind. This is when the interaction took a troubling turn. Detective Burke asked Judge Hayes for her identification. She asked why she needed to provide ID when she was standing in her own doorway, in her own home, having committed no crime. Burke said it was standard procedure when responding to a complaint. Judge Hayes knew this was not standard procedure. Police officers cannot demand identification from someone who is peacefully standing in their own home without reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Judge Hayes asked to see the complaint report or at least know which neighbor had called in the complaint. Burke said that information was confidential. She asked for the incident number or case number for the complaint. Morrison said they didn't have that information with them. These responses immediately raised red flags for Judge Hayes. Police officers responding to a legitimate noise complaint would have that basic information readily available. Judge Hayes calmly but firmly told the officers that without a warrant, probable cause, or exigent circumstances, they had no legal authority to enter her home or demand her identification. She explained that she was not creating any disturbance, no crime was being committed, and she was exercising her Fourth Amendment rights by declining their request to enter. Detective Burke's demeanor changed noticeably. His voice became more aggressive, and he stepped closer to the partially open door. He told Judge Hayes that they could do this the easy way or the hard way. He said if she had nothing to hide, she should just cooperate and let them do their job. Judge Hayes remained calm and repeated that she was not consenting to any search of her home and was not required to provide identification. Officer Morrison then made a statement that would later prove to be crucial evidence in the federal case against both officers. He said that the neighbors were concerned because they had seen a suspicious person lurking around the property and that someone matching her description had been reported as potentially dangerous. Judge Hayes immediately understood what was happening. She was being racially profiled in her own neighborhood, on her own property, on Christmas night. The suspicious person was her, a federal judge, walking around her own yard earlier that day to retrieve her newspaper and check her mailbox. The potentially dangerous individual was a woman in her 50s who weighed barely 130 pounds and was wearing holiday pajamas. Judge Hayes made a decision that would ultimately expose years of misconduct and corruption. She pulled out her cell phone and began recording the interaction. The moment the camera started rolling, both officers became visibly agitated. Burke demanded she stop recording and put the phone away. Judge Hayes calmly stated that she had every legal right to record police officers performing their duties on her property. Morrison stepped forward and reached toward Judge Hayes' phone. She quickly pulled it back and clearly stated that he was not to touch her property. She announced for the recording that the officers were now attempting to interfere with her legal right to document the interaction. Detective Burke then made the statement that would end his career and land him in federal prison. He told Judge Hayes that this was a nice neighborhood with good families, and people like her needed to understand that they were being watched. He said the neighbors had a right to feel safe and secure, and anyone who didn't belong would be dealt with accordingly. Judge Hayes asked Burke to clarify what he meant by people like her. Burke said she knew exactly what he meant. The racism was no longer hidden behind pretenses about noise complaints or suspicious activity. It was out in the open, being recorded in high definition. Officer Morrison then made his own career-ending mistake. He told Judge Hayes that if she didn't start cooperating, they would arrest her for interfering with a police investigation and disorderly conduct. Judge Hayes calmly asked what investigation she was interfering with, given that no crime had been committed and no legitimate complaint had been filed. She then did something that shocked both officers. She clearly stated her name and title for the recording. She identified herself as Federal Judge Veronica Hayes of the United States District Court. She stated that she was being harassed and threatened by two police officers who had no legal basis for their presence on her property. The reaction from both officers was immediate and telling. Instead of apologizing and retreating, both Burke and Morrison became more aggressive. Burke accused Judge Hayes of lying about being a judge. Morrison said that federal judges didn't live in regular neighborhoods like this one. Their skepticism and continued aggression revealed that their harassment was not a case of mistaken identity or a simple error in judgment. Burke demanded that Judge Hayes prove she was a federal judge. She told him she was under no obligation to prove anything to him, particularly when he was unlawfully on her property making demands without legal authority. Morrison said that anyone could claim to be a judge and that they weren't falling for any tricks. Judge Hayes then made an offer that would later be cited in the federal prosecution. She told the officers that if they would leave her property immediately, she would not pursue the matter further. She was giving them an opportunity to end their misconduct and walk away. It was an act of mercy that neither officer deserved, and neither officer was smart enough to accept. Instead of taking the lifeline they had been offered, both officers doubled down on their illegal behavior. Burke said they weren't going anywhere until they had searched the house and verified Judge Hayes' identity to their satisfaction. Morrison added that the neighbors would continue to call in complaints until this situation was resolved properly. Judge Hayes asked both officers for their badge numbers and the name of their supervisor. Burke said she could file a complaint if she wanted to, but it wouldn't go anywhere because they were just doing their jobs. Morrison laughed and said that complaints from people in this neighborhood didn't usually get much attention from their department anyway. These statements would later prove to be prophetic in ways that neither officer could have imagined. Judge Hayes was indeed going to file a complaint, but not the kind of departmental complaint they were expecting. She was going to file federal charges that would ultimately uncover a conspiracy of corruption reaching the highest levels of their police department. The confrontation continued for another 12 minutes, with both officers making increasingly outrageous demands and Judge Hayes calmly asserting her constitutional rights while continuing to record everything. What neither officer realized was that they were not just creating evidence for their own prosecution, they were providing testimony that would expose systematic civil rights violations that had been occurring for years. Have you ever witnessed police misconduct like this in your own community? Let me know in the comments, because what happened next would shock even the most cynical observers of police behavior. The standoff at Judge Hayes' front door was about to take a turn that would expose corruption reaching far beyond two rogue officers. As the recording continued, Detective Burke made a phone call that would become the smoking gun in the federal investigation that followed. He called his sergeant, but what he didn't know was that his sergeant had been waiting for exactly this kind of call for months. Sergeant Michael Torres had been conducting his own quiet investigation into Burke and Morrison for over a year. He had received multiple complaints about both officers targeting residents in upscale neighborhoods, particularly focusing on people of color who lived in areas that were predominantly white. Torres had been building a file, waiting for the right moment to act, and Burke had just handed him that moment on a silver platter. When Burke called Torres that Christmas night, he expected backup and support. Instead, Torres told him to immediately disengage and return to the station. Burke protested, saying they were in the middle of an investigation. Torres firmly ordered both officers to leave the property immediately and report to him within the hour. Judge Hayes heard Burke's side of the phone conversation, and she could tell from his frustrated tone that his supervisor was not supporting his actions. Burke hung up the phone and told Morrison they were leaving. But before departing, Burke made one final threat that would add additional federal charges to his eventual indictment. He told Judge Hayes that this wasn't over, that they knew where she lived, and that the department would be keeping a close eye on her activities. Morrison added that judges weren't untouchable and that she had made enemies tonight who would remember this incident for a long time. These threats against a federal judge constituted separate felonies under federal law, and both officers had just committed them while being recorded. After the officers finally left, Judge Hayes immediately secured her home and began documenting everything that had occurred. She wrote a detailed account while the memory was fresh, noting specific times, exact quotes, and the sequence of events. She uploaded the video recording to multiple cloud storage services and emailed copies to herself at different addresses. Then Judge Hayes did something that demonstrated the difference between an ordinary citizen and someone who understood exactly how the system worked. Instead of calling the local police department to file a complaint, she contacted the FBI field office directly. She also called the United States Attorney's Office and spoke to the duty attorney, explaining that she was a federal judge who had just been threatened and harassed by local police officers. By 10 o'clock that Christmas night, FBI agents were already reviewing Judge Hayes' video recording and preparing to launch a federal civil rights investigation. The U.S. Attorney's Office flagged the case as highest priority, not just because the victim was a federal judge, but because the recorded evidence suggested a pattern of systematic civil rights violations. What happened over the next 72 hours would transform a single incident of police misconduct into one of the largest federal investigations of police corruption in the state's history. The FBI began by interviewing Sergeant Torres, who immediately provided his own files documenting suspicious behavior by Burke and Morrison. Torres revealed that he had been tracking complaints against both officers for 18 months. He had documented 14 separate incidents where Burke and Morrison had targeted minority residents in affluent neighborhoods. The pattern was always the same: fabricated complaints, demands for identification, attempts to search homes without warrants, and threats when residents asserted their rights. Torres explained that he had been building his case carefully because both officers had powerful connections within the department. Burke's father-in-law was a retired police chief who still had influence with city officials. Morrison's uncle was a city councilman who sat on the police oversight committee. Torres knew that any premature action would be buried by department politics. The FBI investigation quickly expanded when agents discovered that Burke and Morrison were not acting alone. Phone records revealed extensive communication between the two officers and several other members of the department, including 2 lieutenants and a captain. These communications showed coordination of their targeting activities and sharing of information about residents they considered problematic. One particularly damning text message thread showed Burke and Morrison discussing their Christmas night encounter with Judge Hayes. Morrison had texted Burke saying they should have arrested her anyway, regardless of who she claimed to be. Burke responded that they would get another chance because people like her always gave them opportunities. The federal investigation uncovered financial records showing that Burke had been receiving monthly payments from a private security company that provided services to several homeowner associations in upscale neighborhoods. The company had been paying Burke to provide extra attention to their client neighborhoods, which translated into increased harassment of minority residents. Morrison had been receiving similar payments, but his arrangement was even more corrupt. He had been taking money directly from individual homeowners who wanted certain residents watched or harassed. The FBI found records of payments ranging from $200 to $1,000 for various services, including conducting pretextual traffic stops and responding to fabricated complaints. The corruption reached even higher levels when investigators discovered that Captain Robert Sterling had been coordinating these activities as part of an unofficial policy to maintain property values in certain neighborhoods. Sterling had been directing officers to increase their presence and enforcement activities in areas where minority families had recently moved in. Sterling's emails, obtained through federal subpoenas, revealed his belief that aggressive policing of minority residents would discourage others from moving to these neighborhoods. He had specifically instructed Burke and Morrison to look for any excuse to make contact with these residents, create documentation of interactions, and make their presence known to the broader community. The scope of the conspiracy became clear when the FBI analyzed 3 years of police dispatch records. They found over 200 instances where Burke, Morrison, and their associates had responded to complaints that were either completely fabricated or grossly exaggerated. In many cases, the officers had generated the complaints themselves using fake names and addresses. Judge Hayes' case was just the tip of the iceberg. The federal investigation identified 47 families who had been systematically harassed by this group of corrupt officers. These families had been subjected to repeated traffic stops, home visits based on fabricated complaints, and ongoing surveillance designed to make them feel unwelcome in their own neighborhoods. The financial impact on these families was staggering. Several had moved away after months of harassment, losing money on their homes and disrupting their children's education. Others had hired attorneys to fight the harassment, spending thousands of dollars on legal fees. Some had installed expensive security systems to document police interactions, while others had simply lived in fear. One family had been targeted because the father worked as a civil rights attorney. Burke and Morrison had conducted 17 separate interactions with this family over 8 months, including traffic stops, noise complaints, and suspicious activity reports. The harassment only stopped when the family finally moved to another state. Another victim was a retired military officer who had purchased a home in one of the targeted neighborhoods. Morrison had pulled him over 6 times in 3 months, always finding minor violations that resulted in citations. When the officer filed complaints with the department, Sterling had dismissed them as unfounded and warned the victim about filing frivolous complaints. the FBI discovered that the corrupt officers had been coordinating with certain neighborhood watch groups to generate complaints and provide intelligence about minority residents. These civilian conspirators had been reporting on everything from visitors to daily routines, creating detailed profiles that the officers used to plan their harassment campaigns. The investigation revealed that Burke had been particularly focused on targeting professional women of color. His communications showed an obsession with what he called successful minorities who thought they were better than their neighbors. Burke had specifically targeted doctors, lawyers, and business owners, believing that humiliating successful minority professionals would send a message to others. Morrison's focus had been slightly different. He had concentrated on younger minority men, particularly those who drove nice cars or wore expensive clothing. His theory was that these individuals were likely involved in criminal activity and needed to be monitored closely. The fact that none of his surveillance ever produced evidence of actual criminal activity didn't deter him from continuing the harassment. The federal prosecutors reviewing the case were amazed by the volume of evidence and the brazenness of the conspiracy. The defendants had documented their own criminal activity through official reports, text messages, emails, and even social media posts. They had created a paper trail that made prosecution almost effortless. Have you ever felt like you were being watched or targeted by law enforcement in your own neighborhood? The evidence in this case would ultimately prove that such feelings were often completely justified. As the federal investigation deepened, prosecutors made a shocking discovery that would transform this case from local corruption into a nationwide scandal. The FBI's forensic accountants uncovered a sophisticated money laundering operation that Burke and Morrison had been running alongside their harassment scheme. The officers hadn't just been taking bribes to target minority residents, they had been systematically stealing funds from the police department's asset forfeiture program. Over the past 4 years, Burke and Morrison had seized over $300,000 in cash and property from residents during their pretextual stops and searches. Instead of properly documenting and processing these seizures through official channels, they had been splitting the money and selling the property through a network of accomplices who ran pawn shops and used car lots across 3 counties. The asset forfeiture scheme worked like this. Burke or Morrison would conduct a traffic stop on a minority resident, claim to smell marijuana or see suspicious behavior, then search the vehicle. Any cash found would be seized under asset forfeiture laws, with the officers claiming it was drug money. The victims were told they could fight the seizure in court, but most people couldn't afford the legal fees or didn't understand their rights. What made this scheme particularly insidious was that Burke and Morrison deliberately targeted people who were unlikely or unable to fight back. They focused on undocumented immigrants who feared deportation, young men with minor criminal records who didn't want police attention, and working-class families who couldn't afford attorneys. These victims often had legitimate reasons for carrying cash, but the officers knew they wouldn't have the resources to challenge the seizures. The FBI traced stolen funds through a complex web of bank accounts, shell companies, and cryptocurrency transactions. Burke had used his share of the stolen money to purchase rental properties, while Morrison had invested in a boat dealership owned by his cousin. Both officers had been living far beyond their official salaries for years, but their lifestyle upgrades had gone unnoticed by department oversight. Federal investigators discovered that Captain Sterling had been receiving a percentage of the stolen funds in exchange for protecting Burke and Morrison from internal investigations. Sterling had systematically buried complaints, destroyed evidence, and intimidated witnesses who tried to report the officers' misconduct. He had even gone so far as to transfer honest officers out of his division when they started asking uncomfortable questions. The conspiracy included civilian accomplices who had been essential to the money laundering operation. A local attorney named David Kessler had been helping the officers create fake legal documents to justify their seizures. Kessler had filed hundreds of forfeiture cases with fabricated evidence, collecting legal fees while helping the officers steal from innocent people. 2 pawn shop owners, brothers named Frank and Tony Romano, had been purchasing stolen property from the officers at below-market prices, then reselling the items for massive profits. The Romanos had processed over $2 million worth of stolen goods, including jewelry, electronics, and vehicles that had been seized during fake investigations. A used car dealer named Susan Crawford had been the final link in the chain, helping the officers convert stolen vehicles into cash. Crawford would purchase seized cars for a fraction of their value, forge new titles, then sell them to unsuspecting buyers. She had processed 43 stolen vehicles over 3 years, generating nearly $500,000 in profits for the criminal enterprise. The federal grand jury heard testimony from victim after victim who had been robbed by these officers under color of law. Maria Santos, a house cleaner, testified about how Burke had seized $800 from her car during a traffic stop, money she had saved for her daughter's quinceañera. Despite having receipts proving the money came from legitimate work, Santos was told she would have to hire a lawyer and go to court to get her money back. James Wilson, a construction worker, described how Morrison had seized his tools during a bogus search of his truck. Wilson had purchased the tools with money from his tax refund, but Morrison claimed they were too expensive for someone in Wilson's profession and must have been stolen. Wilson lost $3,000 worth of equipment and was unable to work for weeks while he replaced his tools. An elderly couple named Robert and Dorothy Kim testified about how Burke had seized $22,000 from their car during a routine traffic stop. The money was their life savings, which they were taking to purchase a new car after their old one broke down. Burke claimed the large amount of cash was evidence of drug trafficking, despite the couple's clean records and obvious explanation for having the money. The psychological impact on these victims was devastating. Many had lost faith in law enforcement entirely, refusing to call police even when they were genuine victims of crime. Some had moved away from the community, while others had given up on pursuing justice because they couldn't afford legal representation. Dr. Patricia Rodriguez, a forensic psychologist who evaluated many of the victims, testified about the long-term trauma caused by police corruption. She explained how being robbed by officers destroyed people's sense of safety and trust in institutions that were supposed to protect them. Several victims had developed anxiety disorders and depression as a result of their encounters with Burke and Morrison. The federal prosecutors built their case methodically, using the officers' own communications to prove intent and coordination. Text messages showed Burke and Morrison planning their criminal activities, dividing territories, and celebrating successful thefts. In one particularly damning exchange, Morrison had texted Burke a photo of cash he had just stolen with the caption, "Christmas bonus came early this year." Bank records proved that both officers had been depositing large amounts of cash that couldn't be explained by their official salaries. Burke had made over 50 cash deposits exceeding $5,000 each, while Morrison had purchased expensive items with cash despite having minimal savings in his bank accounts. The officers' spending patterns revealed the extent of their criminal enterprise. Burke had purchased a vacation home in Florida, a luxury SUV, and expensive jewelry for his wife, all while claiming financial hardship to avoid paying child support from his first marriage. Morrison had bought a 30-foot boat, high-end fishing equipment, and a motorcycle, despite earning less than $60,000 per year as a police officer. Federal agents executed search warrants on all the defendants' homes and businesses, seizing millions of dollars in assets purchased with stolen money. The searches uncovered detailed records that the criminals had kept of their illegal activities, including spreadsheets tracking stolen funds and correspondence about laundering operations. At Burke's house, agents found a safe containing over $40,000 in cash, along with jewelry and watches that had been stolen from seizure victims. Burke's wife initially claimed the items were gifts, but serial numbers matched property that had been reported stolen during traffic stops. Morrison's boat became a symbol of the conspiracy when agents discovered hidden compartments that had been used to transport stolen goods. The boat's purchase documents showed it had been bought with cash shortly after a series of particularly lucrative seizures, creating a clear timeline of criminal proceeds being converted into personal assets. The federal investigation expanded beyond the immediate conspirators when agents discovered that the corruption had infected multiple levels of the police department. Internal affairs investigators had been compromised, with several supervisors taking bribes to ignore complaints about Burke and Morrison. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Walsh had been receiving monthly payments to ensure that complaints against Burke and Morrison never reached the police chief's desk. Walsh had destroyed evidence, intimidated witnesses, and falsified investigation reports to protect the corrupt officers. Her betrayal was particularly shocking because she had built a reputation as an advocate for police accountability. The police union's involvement in covering up the corruption added another layer to the federal charges. Union President Michael Rodriguez had been using member dues to pay legal fees for Burke and Morrison while publicly defending them as victims of anti-police bias. Rodriguez had organized rallies and media campaigns to portray the officers as heroes, being persecuted for doing their jobs. As more evidence emerged, it became clear that the corruption extended to city government officials who had been aware of the problems but chose to ignore them. The mayor had received multiple reports about asset forfeiture abuse, but had taken no action because the seized funds helped balance the city's budget. City council members had voted to increase the police department's asset forfeiture budget despite knowing about complaints of abuse. They had been more interested in the revenue stream than in protecting citizens' rights, creating an environment where corruption could flourish. The federal prosecutors faced a complex challenge in determining how many charges to file and against how many defendants. The evidence supported charges against 12 police officers, 7 civilian accomplices, and 4 city officials. The potential sentences ranged from 5 years for minor participants to life in prison for the main conspirators. Judge Hayes watched the investigation unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She was pleased that justice was being served, but horrified by the scope of the corruption that her Christmas night encounter had exposed. She realized that if she hadn't been a federal judge with the knowledge and resources to fight back, Burke and Morrison would have continued their criminal enterprise indefinitely. The media coverage of the case was intense, with national news outlets sending reporters to cover what was being called one of the largest police corruption cases in recent history. The story had everything: racist cops, stolen money, government cover-ups, and a federal judge who refused to be intimidated. Public protests erupted as details of the corruption became known, with community groups demanding accountability and reform. The protests were largely peaceful but persistent, with demonstrators calling for the resignation of city officials who had enabled the corruption. The police department's reputation was in shambles, with recruiting efforts failing and veteran officers requesting transfers to other agencies. Community trust had been shattered, and it would take years to rebuild relationships with the minority neighborhoods that had been systematically targeted. As the federal grand jury prepared to issue indictments, the full scope of Burke and Morrison's criminal enterprise was finally coming into focus. What had started as a simple case of racial profiling had revealed a sophisticated criminal organization that had been operating for years under the protection of corrupt supervisors and complicit city officials. ICIT City. Officials. The federal grand jury deliberated for 3 weeks before returning the largest police corruption indictment in state history. 47 separate charges were filed against 12 defendants, with Burke and Morrison each facing 31 felony counts, including conspiracy, civil rights violations, theft, money laundering, and racketeering under the RICO Act. The indictment detailed how the criminal enterprise had operated like an organized crime family, with Burke serving as the leader and Morrison as his lieutenant. Captain Sterling was charged as the primary enabler who had used his position to protect the operation from internal oversight. The civilian accomplices faced charges ranging from money laundering to conspiracy to violate civil rights. When the indictments were unsealed, Burke and Morrison were arrested at their homes in coordinated FBI raids. News footage showed both officers being led away in handcuffs while their neighbors watched in shock. Burke's wife collapsed on the front lawn, while Morrison attempted to cover his face with his jacket as photographers captured his arrest. The arraignment hearing drew massive media attention, with reporters from across the country packing the federal courthouse. Both officers pleaded not guilty to all charges, but their attorneys knew they were facing overwhelming evidence and the possibility of life sentences under the RICO charges. Federal prosecutor Rebecca Chen outlined the government's case during a press conference that lasted over an hour. She detailed how the conspiracy had stolen nearly $2 million from innocent victims while systematically violating the civil rights of minority residents. Chen announced that the investigation was ongoing and that additional charges were likely. The impact on the victims began to emerge as the federal restitution process started. Over 100 families had been identified as victims of the conspiracy, with total damages exceeding $3 million when lost property, legal fees, and emotional distress were calculated. Many victims had never reported their encounters because they didn't believe anyone would listen to complaints against police officers. Burke's trial began first, with prosecutors presenting a devastating case built entirely on documentary evidence and the defendant's own communications. The jury heard recordings of Burke bragging about his thefts, saw bank records proving he had deposited stolen money, and watched surveillance video of him conducting fake traffic stops. The defense attempted to argue that Burke had been following department policy and that any seized funds had been properly documented. This strategy collapsed when prosecutors played recordings of Burke explicitly discussing how to avoid proper documentation and divide stolen money among conspirators. Burke received 12 years in federal prison after a jury convicted him on all 31 charges. Morrison got 10 years, while Captain Sterling was sentenced to 8 years for his role in the cover-up. Judge Hayes continued serving on the federal bench, using her experience to advocate for police reform nationwide. The department was placed under federal oversight for 5 years, and over $40 million in stolen assets were returned to victims. Sometimes justice isn't just about punishment. It's about ensuring that what happened in that Christmas night doorway never happens to another family again. This case was intense, but this case on the right-hand side is even more insane.
Uncovering the truth is more important now than ever. Our goal is to hold power to account by letting the evidence speak for itself. The records don't lie. Thanks for watching and being part of this journey.